At 68 years old, after her children divided up the family home, the savings account, and every valuable possession she and her late husband had spent a lifetime building, Martha Ellison was left with only one thing nobody wanted: a condemned property hidden deep in the hills outside Ashwick, Kentucky.
She had $47 to her name. Her son laughed when the lawyer read the will. Her daughter barely looked up. The house had been abandoned for years. The basement was flooded. The county planned to tear it down. But when Martha drove out to see it for herself, she noticed something beneath the black water that nobody else had seen. Using the last of her money, she bought a pump and began draining the basement. And when the water finally disappeared, she uncovered a hand-cut stone staircase descending into the darkness below. A staircase leading to a secret her family had spent decades overlooking, and a legacy someone had desperately tried to bury forever. The will reading took place on a gray Tuesday morning in March. Rain tapped softly against the windows of a small law office in downtown Lexington, while Martha Ellison sat quietly in a faded leather chair, her purse folded neatly in her lap. She had spent 30 years working night shifts at St. Joseph Hospital. Sitting patiently in uncomfortable rooms was something she had learned long ago. Across from her sat her son, Brandon. He arrived 10 minutes late, carrying a coffee he never finished and checking his phone every few seconds. Beside him sat his younger sister, Vanessa. She stared out the window with folded arms and hardly spoke a word. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began reading. Beatrice Rowan had been thorough. Every item in the estate had a destination. The family house on Willow Creek Lane went to Brandon. The sedan went to Vanessa. The savings account, just over $11,000, would be divided equally between them. Martha listened without expression. She wasn't interested in fighting over possessions. Her mother had lived a long life. That was enough. Then the lawyer reached the final page. And to Martha Ellison, he said, I leave the property located at 278 Cedar Run Road, Ashwick, Kentucky, formerly owned by the late Silas Rowan. Brandon looked up immediately. You're kidding. The lawyer remained expressionless. No. The old Rowan place? Brandon laughed. The one that's been condemned? The same property. Vanessa didn't even turn around. Martha remembered the place instantly. Uncle Silas, the quiet man who smelled like cedar shavings and spent most family gatherings sitting alone on the porch. She hadn't seen him in years. Brandon shook his head. Mom, that place is worthless. The basement's been flooded forever. The county's been trying to tear it down. The lawyer slid the documents across the desk. Martha signed them without hesitation. Outside, Brandon caught her before she reached her car. Listen, he said. I know somebody who works with a development company. They might pay $10,000 or $15,000 for the lot. I'm going to see it first. He stared at her. See what? Martha opened the door of her aging Honda Civic. The odometer showed more than 160,000 miles. Everything she still owned fit inside it. Maybe nothing, she said. Then why bother? She looked past him, toward the distant clouds gathering over the horizon. Because somewhere, deep in her memory, she could still see Uncle Silas kneeling beside her when she was 7 years old. She remembered cool stone walls, the smell of fresh-cut wood, and a carved bird he had placed carefully into her small hands. This, he had told her, is where I keep the things that matter. For reasons she couldn't explain, those words had never left her. 3 hours later, Martha was driving southeast toward Ashwick. She had no idea that the inheritance everyone laughed at was about to change her life forever. By the time Martha reached Ashwick, the sun was sinking behind the hills. The small town looked much the way she remembered. One main street, a hardware store, a church with a white steeple, a diner with faded lettering on the front window. The years had passed, but not much else seemed to have changed. She drove through town without stopping. The road narrowed beyond the last cluster of buildings. Soon, pavement gave way to gravel. Trees closed in on both sides. A mile later, a rusted mailbox appeared beside the road. 278 Cedar Run Road. Martha slowed the car. For a moment, she simply stared. The house looked worse than she had imagined. Gray wooden siding peeled from the walls. Several windows were covered with weathered plywood. The front porch sagged noticeably in the center. A bright yellow condemnation notice hung crookedly beside the front door. Tall weeds swallowed most of the yard. It looked less like a home and more like a place the world had forgotten. Then she noticed she wasn't alone. A dog sat on the porch, brown and white, long ears, thin enough that his ribs showed through his coat. The animal lifted its head as her car rolled to a stop. But it didn't bark. It didn't run away. It simply watched. Martha stepped from the Civic and closed the door quietly. The dog remained still. "Well," she said softly, "looks like you're the welcome committee." Its tail moved once against the porch boards. That was all. She walked closer and sat carefully on the second porch step. The dog studied her. His eyes were tired, patient, the eyes of something that had spent a long time waiting. "You belong to Silas?" The tail moved again. Martha smiled sadly. "I'll take that as a yes." Several seconds passed. Then the dog stood, slowly, carefully. He crossed the porch and settled beside her, leaning a shoulder gently against her leg. Martha felt an unexpected lump rise in her throat. She scratched behind one floppy ear. "You need a name." The dog closed his eyes. The answer came instantly. "Ranger." The dog opened one eye as if approving the choice. For the first time all day, Martha laughed. The sound surprised even her. Together they sat quietly, while evening shadows stretched across the property. As she looked at the house, old memories began returning. She remembered being 7 years old, remembered Uncle Silas taking her hand, remembered descending cool stone steps beneath the house. She remembered shelves lined with carvings, deer, birds, bears, pieces so detailed they looked alive. Most of all, she remembered the workshop, a hidden room beneath the house. Or at least, she thought she remembered one. After 60 years, memories could play tricks. Still, the feeling remained. Something important had existed here. Something worth protecting. Finally, Martha stood. Ranger followed. The front door groaned when she pushed it open. The smell hit her immediately. Mold, rotting wood, standing water. Dust coated every surface. The house was empty, except for a few broken pieces of furniture. At the end of a narrow hallway stood a half-open door, and behind it were stone stairs leading down. Martha switched on her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Black water filled the basement almost to the top. The surface reflected the light like glass. But beneath the murky water, something caught her eye. Straight lines, stone edges. Workmanship too precise to be natural. She stared for a long moment. Then a voice behind her made her jump. Not much worth saving down there. Martha turned. A tall man stood in the doorway, weathered face, work jacket, gray eyes. He nodded once. "Gideon Hart," he said. "I live across the road." His gaze shifted toward the flooded basement. "Question is, how long do you plan on staying?" Martha looked back at the black water. Something deep inside her answered before she could think. "As long as it takes." And for the first time, she truly meant it. Gideon Hart stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Martha shine her flashlight across the black water. "The basement's been flooding for years," he said. "Every spring gets worse." Martha didn't take her eyes off the water. "Has anyone ever tried pumping it out?" Gideon gave a short laugh. "For what? The county condemned the place almost 2 years ago. Most folks figured it would collapse eventually. Most folks aren't standing here." That earned the faintest hint of a smile. "No," Gideon admitted. "I suppose they aren't." He tipped his hat and stepped back toward the porch. "If you need anything, I'm across the road." Then he disappeared into the evening. That night, Martha slept in her Civic. She folded a blanket across her lap while Ranger curled up in the back seat as if he had been riding there his entire life. The temperature dropped after midnight. Wind rattled loose boards on the old house. Twice Martha woke and stared through the windshield toward the dark silhouette of the condemned property. Each time she found herself thinking about Uncle Silas, about the strange stonework beneath the water, about the certainty she couldn't explain. Something was down there. The next morning she drove into town. The $47 in her wallet felt painfully light. She walked into the hardware store anyway. Rows of tools lined the walls. Ladders hung from the ceiling. The clerk behind the counter looked up. "Can I help you?" "I need a sump pump." The man raised an eyebrow. "What for?" "The Rowan property. His expression changed instantly. The condemned place? That's the one. He stared at her for a moment before leading her toward the back of the store. The cheapest pump cost more than she could comfortably afford. By the time she purchased the pump, hose, extension cord, and a pair of oversized rubber boots, nearly every dollar she had was gone. As the clerk loaded the boxes into her car, he shook his head. "You're serious about this?" Martha smiled. "I didn't drive 3 hours to quit." Word traveled quickly through Ashwick. By afternoon, people were already talking. The woman who inherited Silas Rowan's flooded house. The woman sleeping in her car. The woman trying to drain a basement everyone else had given up on. Martha didn't care. She carried the pump inside, lowered it carefully into the water, connected the hose. Then she sat on the porch beside Ranger and waited. The machine hummed. A thin stream of muddy water began flowing into the weeds outside. It wasn't much, but it was movement. Progress. By sunset, the water level had dropped only a few inches. Martha considered that a victory. The next morning, she woke to find someone standing beside the porch, a gray-haired woman carrying a paper bag. "You're Martha." It wasn't a question. Martha nodded. The woman handed her the bag. Inside were 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a slice of pie. "I'm Louise Mercer," she said. "I own the diner." "You don't have to do this." "Maybe not." Louise glanced toward the house. "But somebody ought to." Before Martha could answer, Louise climbed back into her truck and drove away. The small act of kindness stayed with her all day. So did the exhaustion. The pump ran constantly. The water level fell slowly, too slowly. Late that evening, as Martha sat on the porch listening to the motor strain, headlights appeared across the road. A pickup truck rolled into the yard. Gideon climbed out, carrying something heavy. Behind him sat a portable generator and a second sump pump nearly twice the size of hers. He set both on the grass. Martha stared. "What is this?" Gideon folded his arms. "A mercy mission." "I didn't ask for help." "No." He looked toward the struggling little pump. "But I couldn't keep watching that thing fight a lake." For the first time in days, Martha laughed. Together, they installed the larger pump. The generator roared to life. Water surged through the hoses, far faster than before. Within hours, the level began dropping visibly. As darkness settled over Cedar Run Road, stone walls slowly emerged from beneath the water line, perfectly cut, perfectly fitted, and unmistakably man-made. Martha stared into the basement. The deeper the water fell, the more certain she became. Someone had built something extraordinary beneath this house, and at last, it was beginning to reveal itself. For the next 4 days, the pumps never stopped running. The generator hummed through the daylight hours and growled beneath the stars at night. Martha and Gideon checked fuel levels, adjusted hoses, and watched as years of stagnant water slowly disappeared. Ranger remained close by the entire time. Sometimes he sat beside Martha on the porch. Sometimes he wandered through the empty house. But every evening he returned to the basement door and stared into the darkness below, as though he remembered something waiting there. By the 5th morning, only a few inches of muddy water remained. Martha pulled on her oversized boots and carefully descended the stone stairs. The smell of damp earth filled the air. Her flashlight swept across the basement floor. For the first time, she could see the entire room. The walls were astonishing. Every block had been cut by hand. No cracks, no rough edges, no visible mortar. The workmanship looked more like something from another century than a forgotten basement beneath a condemned house. Gideon crouched beside one wall and ran his hand along the stone. "I've worked construction for 30 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen foundation work like this." Martha nodded. Neither had she. The room stretched farther than she remembered from childhood. Much farther. The floor itself appeared perfectly level, despite decades of flooding. Yet something felt wrong. Something was missing. She slowly swept her flashlight from corner to corner. The room looked empty, completely empty. No fool, sir. No tool, sir. No workshop. Nothing. A knot formed in her stomach. Had she imagined everything? Had 60 years transformed a childhood memory into something that never existed? For several long moments she stood silently. Then the flashlight beam reached the far corner. She froze. "Gideon." He looked up. "What?" Martha pointed. Near the back wall,
Partially hidden behind a square stone support column was a dark opening in the floor,
4 feet wide, perfectly square, surrounded by the same carefully cut stone. Gideon stood immediately. Together, they crossed the room. As they approached, the opening became clearer, and inside it was something neither of them expected. Steps, another staircase. Stone steps descending deeper into the earth. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Gideon broke the silence. Those aren't foundation stairs. No, they go somewhere. Martha stepped closer. Cool air drifted upward from below, different from the stale dampness of the basement. Cleaner, drier, and carrying a scent she recognized instantly. Wood. Old wood. Sawdust. Her heartbeat quickened. I knew it, she whispered. Gideon looked at her. You remembered this place? Not exactly. She stared into the darkness. But I remembered enough. The staircase curved gently downward. Its walls disappeared into blackness. Whoever had carved it had done so with extraordinary care. Each step was perfectly even, every edge smooth, as if the builder had expected people to walk there for generations. Gideon switched on a larger flashlight. Well, he said, you inherited the place. Martha smiled nervously. And if there's a monster down there, technically, it's your monster. For the first time since arriving in Ashwick, she laughed without forcing it. Then she took a deep breath. Together, they began descending. 1 step, then another. 22 steps in total. Martha counted every one. At the bottom, the staircase curved left and opened into a vast underground chamber. She stopped moving. So did Gideon. Neither could believe what they were seeing. The room stretched at least 50 feet across. Massive oak shelves lined the walls. Workbenches stood in neat rows. Hand tools hung from pegboards exactly where they had been left. And everywhere, on shelves, beside benches, against walls, stood furniture. Dozens of pieces. Chairs, tables, cabinets, rocking chairs, bookcases. Every piece handcrafted. Every piece beautiful. Every piece untouched by the flood. Martha felt tears sting her eyes. The workshop. It had been real. Uncle Silas hadn't hidden treasures underground. He had hidden a lifetime of work. As they slowly walked through the chamber, their flashlight beams revealed more wonders. Then, in the far corner, beyond the furniture, Martha noticed something else. A dark walnut cabinet, standing alone against the stone wall. Unlike everything around it, its single door was locked. And somehow, she knew that whatever waited inside would explain everything. For a long moment, Martha and Gideon simply stood in silence. The underground workshop felt frozen in time. Dust covered some surfaces, but everything remained exactly where Silas Rowan had left it. The tools hung neatly from their hooks. The workbenches stood ready for use. The furniture lined the walls like silent witnesses guarding decades of secrets. Ranger finally gathered enough courage to descend the staircase. His nails clicked softly against the stone floor. The old hound wandered through the workshop slowly, sniffing chair legs and workbenches before settling beside the largest table in the room, as though he had returned home. Martha approached the locked walnut cabinet. The brass lock looked old, but well-maintained. She pulled gently on the handle. It didn't move. Think we should force it? Gideon asked. Martha shook her head. No. Why not? She rested her hand on the cabinet door. Because Silas wanted somebody to find this place. Gideon looked around the workshop. Hard to argue with that. If he wanted this cabinet broken open, he wouldn't have locked it. The two of them spent the next hour searching. They checked drawers, toolboxes, shelves, storage crates, every corner of the workshop. No key. As evening approached, they climbed back upstairs. Louise Mercer arrived shortly afterward, carrying a casserole dish and fresh bread. When she heard about the workshop, her eyes widened. You're telling me Silas had an entire room under the house? A very large room, Gideon said. And a locked cabinet. Louise shook her head. That sounds exactly like Silas. What does? Martha asked, keeping things to himself. Before Louise could explain further, another voice interrupted. He kept things because he didn't want credit. All three turned. An elderly woman stood near the porch steps. She leaned on a wooden cane. Her white hair was pulled into a loose knot. Her face carried the deep lines of someone who had lived a very long life. Gideon immediately stood. Evelyn Pike. The old woman waved him back down. I can still walk. Her sharp eyes settled on Martha. So you're the one. The one what? The one who finally came.
A strange chill passed through Martha.
Evelyn slowly climbed the steps and sat in one of the porch chairs. For several seconds, she simply looked at the house. Then she smiled softly. It's still standing. You knew Silas? Martha asked. I knew him for over 50 years. Martha exchanged a glance with Gideon. The workshop? Evelyn nodded. I knew about that too. Then Porce fell silent. What? Gideon asked. You knew it was there this whole time? I promised him I wouldn't tell anyone. Martha felt her heart begin to race. Evelyn reached into the pocket of her sweater. When her hand emerged, she was holding a small brass key, dark with age, perfectly preserved. Silence settled across the porch. He gave me this 2 years ago, Evelyn said quietly. He told me to wait. Wait for what? The right person. She looked directly at Martha. I believe that's you. Martha stared at the key. Her hands trembled slightly as Evelyn placed it in her palm. The metal felt warm despite the evening air. What opens? Gideon asked. Evelyn smiled. You already know. Minutes later, they returned underground. The workshop seemed even more mysterious now. Martha crossed the room and stopped before the walnut cabinet. She inserted the key. The lock turned smoothly, as though it had been opened yesterday, not years ago. The door swung outward. Inside sat dozens of leather-bound journals, neatly stacked, carefully organized. Each spine carried a year, and onward, decade after decade, a lifetime preserved on paper. Martha removed the oldest journal and opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. The first entry read, April 3rd, 1975. Built my first chair today. It's crooked. The joints don't fit. But every piece of wood teaches something if you're patient enough to listen. Martha smiled. That sounded exactly like Silas. She turned another page, then another, and slowly her smile disappeared. Because the journals weren't only about woodworking. Mixed among the notes were names, dates, addresses, dollar amounts, records, carefully documented records. And as Martha read the first few entries, she realized something astonishing. Silas Rowan had spent decades helping people quietly, secretly, and no one had ever known. The next morning, Martha returned to the workshop before sunrise. She carried a thermos of coffee and one of the journals tucked under her arm. Ranger followed closely behind. The old hound immediately settled beside Silas's workbench, while Martha sat at a nearby table and continued reading. Hours passed. The deeper she went into the journals, the more unbelievable the story became. Silas had documented everything. Not for recognition, not for praise, simply because he believed records mattered. Each furniture sale was carefully listed, each payment recorded, each act of kindness preserved in ink. Again and again, the money flowed away from him and toward people who needed help. A widow who couldn't afford heating oil, a veteran whose porch had collapsed after a storm, a teenager whose school books cost more than her family could pay. Every entry told the same story. Silas built furniture. Silas sold furniture. Then Silas quietly gave most of the money away. By mid-morning, Martha reached an entry that made her stop breathing. July 12th, 1988. Sold walnut dining set. Applied $1,200 toward the Ellison mortgage account. Family never informed. Martha stared at the page. Her hands began trembling. She remembered that year. Her husband had recently lost his job. Bills had piled up. 1 month, a payment had mysteriously appeared on their mortgage statement. The bank had called it an accounting correction. They had accepted the explanation and moved on. Now she knew the truth. Silas had paid it. Tears blurred her vision. She turned the page. The next entries were even harder to read. August 1996. Tuition payment submitted for Brandon Ellison. Anonymous scholarship arrangement approved. Martha lowered the journal. No. The word escaped before she realized she had spoken. Brandon's college education. For years, they had believed an academic scholarship covered the cost. Brandon had proudly told everyone he earned it. Martha had believed him. The journal told a different story. Silas had paid nearly every semester. One handcrafted dining table at a time. Footsteps echoed through the workshop. Gideon arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. He immediately noticed Martha's expression. What happened? Without speaking, she handed him the journal. He read several pages. His face slowly changed. My God. Keep reading. A few minutes later, Gideon sat heavily on a stool. Neither spoke, because another entry had appeared. May 4th, 2001. Hospital bill paid for Vanessa Ellison. Child requires surgery. Family-informed charitable fund covered expense. Martha closed her eyes. Vanessa had been 12. The operation had saved her mobility after a serious injury. The hospital had claimed a donor program covered the costs. There had never been a donor program. There had only been Silas working alone beneath this house, building furniture, selling it quietly, then using the money to rescue people who never knew his name. Around noon, Evelyn Pike arrived carrying another box. Inside were old letters and receipts Silas had left in her care. The documents confirmed everything. For 40 years, he had funded lives across Ashwick, sometimes through banks, sometimes through schools, sometimes through churches, always anonymously, always without taking credit. Later that afternoon, Gideon wandered through the workshop, carrying one of the journals. Suddenly, he stopped beside a cherry rocking chair. His expression hardened. My wife had one exactly like this. Martha looked up. What? Evelyn. The old woman nodded slowly. Rose Hart. Gideon stared at her. Evelyn smiled sadly. It arrived as a wedding gift, didn't it? His face went pale. How do you know that? Because Silas built it. The workshop fell silent. Gideon sat down heavily in the chair. His late wife had spent decades rocking in it. They had never known who sent it. Now they did. As evening settled outside, Martha looked around the workshop differently. At first, she had thought this place was a hidden treasure. Now she understood. The furniture wasn't the treasure. The money wasn't the treasure. The treasure was the lives Silas had quietly held together for 40 years. And somewhere among the remaining journals, Martha suspected there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered. Secrets that might explain why someone had wanted this workshop buried beneath floodwater forever. That night, Martha could not sleep. She lay in the back seat of her Civic while Ranger rested beside the car, and her thoughts kept returning to the journals. For 40 years, Silas Rowan had quietly changed lives. Yet in the final entries, something had clearly frightened him, something powerful enough to appear repeatedly in his careful records. The next morning, she carried the newest journals into the workshop. The leather covers showed more wear than the earlier volumes. Silas's handwriting had become slightly shakier. Age was catching up with him, but his attention to detail never faded. Martha opened the journal marked 2021. At first, the entries seemed ordinary. Furniture orders, tool repairs, wood deliveries. Then she reached a page that made her stop. March 18th, 2021. Water discovered near north wall. First seepage in 46 years. Will monitor. Martha frowned. She turned the page. April 2nd. Water worse. Not rain-related. Source unknown. Another page. May 14th. Walked creek line today. Channel appears different. Need further inspection. Martha sat straighter. By noon, she had read 6 months of entries. Each one painted a disturbing picture. The flooding hadn't happened naturally. It had begun suddenly, and it had grown worse at an alarming pace. When Gideon arrived, she handed him the journal immediately. He read in silence. Then he looked up. The creek changed course? That's what Silas believed. Gideon rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Creeks don't usually move that fast. The next entry deepened their concern. August 8th. Visited by representative from Summit Ridge Development Partners. Offered $50,000 for property. Refused. Martha read the line twice. The property had been condemned. The house was deteriorating. Yet someone had offered $50,000 for it years earlier. That made no sense, unless they wanted something other than the house. She continued reading. September 23rd. Second visit from development company. Offer increased. Refused again. Representative seemed irritated. November 10th. Flooding worsening. Creek channel definitely altered. Someone has changed drainage upstream. Workshop at risk. The room fell silent. Even Ranger lifted his head. Gideon closed the journal slowly. I don't like this. Neither do I. That afternoon, they examined the remaining journals. Near the end of the final volume, they found an envelope tucked between 2 pages. The paper had yellowed slightly. Martha carefully opened it. Inside was a business card. Summit Ridge Development Partners. The same company mentioned in the journals. On the back, written in Silas's unmistakable handwriting, was a single letter, B. Martha stared at it. The workshop suddenly felt colder. What does it mean? Gideon asked. She didn't answer immediately, because deep down, she already knew. B. Brandon. Her son. The realization hit like a physical blow. Several years earlier, Brandon had mentioned knowing developers interested in rural properties. At the time, she had barely paid attention. Now the memory returned with disturbing clarity. The card slipped slightly in her fingers. No. But the denial sounded weak. Gideon studied her face. You know somebody whose name starts with B? Martha nodded slowly. My son? Neither spoke. Outside, wind rattled the trees above the hidden workshop. Finally, Gideon stood. I want to look at that creek. Martha looked up. You think Silas was right? I think a man who documented 40 years of his life doesn't suddenly start imagining things. He picked up his jacket. If somebody redirected the water, there will be signs. And if there are? Gideon looked toward the staircase leading back to daylight. Then this workshop wasn't destroyed by accident. After he left, Martha remained alone underground. She walked slowly between the furniture Silas had spent a lifetime creating. Each piece represented patience, generosity, purpose. A life devoted to helping others. Someone had tried to bury all of it beneath floodwater. Someone had wanted this place forgotten. Martha looked down at the business card again. The letter on the back seemed almost to stare at her. B. For the first time since arriving in Ashwick, she wasn't wondering what Silas had hidden. She was wondering who had been trying to hide it, and whether her own son was connected to the answer. Gideon was gone for nearly 3 hours. Martha spent the morning in the workshop, but she couldn't concentrate on the journals. Again and again, her eyes drifted toward the business card lying on the workbench. Summit Ridge Development Partners, and the letter B written on the back. Every time she looked at it, a different memory surfaced. Brandon talking about investment opportunities. Brandon mentioning land developers. Brandon insisting she sell the property before she had even seen it. None of those things proved anything, yet together they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. Around noon, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. A moment later, footsteps echoed from the staircase. Martha stood, expecting Gideon. Instead, Brandon appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He froze. The workshop spread before him. The enforcer. The shelves. The tosser. The vaulted stone ceiling. For several long seconds, he simply stared. My God. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Martha said nothing. Brandon slowly walked forward. His hand brushed the back of a handcrafted chair, then a cabinet. Then one of the workbenches. This was here the whole time. The whole time. His eyes remained fixed on the room. I heard people talking in town. Martha folded her arms. People are talking a lot these days. They said there was a workshop. He shook his head. They didn't say it was this. Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, Martha walked to the cabinet and removed several journals. She placed them on the workbench. Read. Brandon frowned. What are these? Silas's records. He opened the first journal. At first, his expression remained neutral. Then he reached the entries about the mortgage. His brow tightened. A few pages later, he found the college payments. His face drained of color. No. Martha said nothing. He continued reading, page after page, entry after entry. The scholarship. The tuition payments. The anonymous support. Everything. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. I didn't know. No, Martha said quietly. You didn't. The workshop felt unusually silent. Even Ranger remained still. Brandon lowered himself onto a stool. He paid for college? For 4 years. I thought I earned that scholarship. You earned your grades. Martha's voice remained calm. Silas paid the bills. Brandon stared at the journal. The confidence that usually surrounded him seemed gone. For the first time in years, he looked like a confused little boy. Then Martha placed the business card on the table. His eyes immediately found it. Enforcer. The change in his face told her everything. Brandon, he swallowed. Where did you find that? In Silas's final journal. The workshop grew very still. Outside, wind moved through the trees above them. Finally, Brandon sat down heavily. His shoulders sagged. I told them about the property. Martha closed her eyes, not because she was surprised, because hearing it spoken aloud hurt. I knew some people at Summit Ridge. His voice sounded distant.
They were looking for land.
So you gave them Silas's name? He nodded. I thought they'd make an offer. You thought an old man living alone would sell? I thought the property was worthless. Martha's jaw tightened. The flooding started after that. Brandon looked away. I didn't tell anyone to flood anything. Did you ask questions when it happened? Silence. Long silence. Finally, he shook his head. No. The answer hurt almost as much as a confession.
Because it was honest.
Brandon hadn't ordered the destruction, but he had looked away when it benefited him. Martha handed him the final journal. Read the last entries. He did. Several minutes passed. Then he reached the final page. The page where Silas described the rising water. The page where he wrote about being tired. The page where he recorded his fear that everything would be lost. Brandon's hands trembled. Slowly, he closed the journal. For a long time, nobody spoke. Then he whispered something so quietly, Martha almost missed it. I never even visited him. The truth settled heavily between them. Not anger. Not excuses. Just truth. And sometimes truth weighed more than either. As Martha looked at her son sitting among the furniture Silas had built, she realized something important. The workshop had revealed more than hidden secrets. It had revealed hidden failures. And now Brandon would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be after facing them. The days that followed felt different. The tension that had surrounded the property since Martha's arrival slowly began to change into something else. Hope. Word about the underground workshop spread far beyond Cedar Run Road. At first, it was only whispers in Louise Mercer's diner. Then conversations at the hardware store. Then stories shared after church services. Before long, nearly everyone in Ashwick had heard about the hidden workshop beneath Silas Rowan's house. And everyone seemed to have a story. 3 days after Brandon's visit, Louise arrived, carrying a notebook. She set it on Martha's kitchen table. We need a gathering. A gathering? A community dinner. Martha smiled. You don't think small, do you? Louise laughed. Not when there's pie involved. Within hours, people began volunteering. Tables appeared. Chairs appeared. Food appeared. Nobody seemed to know exactly who organized what. The town simply started helping, the way small towns sometimes do. On Saturday afternoon, the first visitors arrived. Then more and more. By sunset, nearly 30 people stood in the yard surrounding the once condemned property. Martha guided small groups through the basement and down the hidden staircase. Every time someone entered the workshop, the reaction was the same. Silence, wonder, disbelief. The room had that effect on people. An elderly man stopped beside one of the bookcases. His eyes widened. I know this craftsmanship. Martha turned. You do? He nodded. After the tornado in 2008, somebody left lumber on my property with a note saying, "Thought you could use a hand." His voice softened. I spent years wondering who sent it. Across the room, a woman in her 30s held up a photograph on her phone. The image showed a beautifully crafted writing desk. This appeared on my parents' porch when I was 16. She looked around the workshop. The joints are identical. Her eyes filled with tears. It was Silas. One by one, the stories emerged. Anonymous gifts. Furniture left without signatures. Heating bills paid unexpectedly. School supplies that somehow appeared every August. Medical expenses covered by mysterious donors. Every road seemed to lead back to the same man, Silas Rowan, the quiet woodworker who never asked for recognition. Martha watched as decades of hidden kindness finally came to light. Then another car pulled into the driveway. She recognized it immediately. Vanessa. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Vanessa stepped out. She looked around at the gathering, the restored yard, the people, the workshop beneath the house, and finally, at her mother. Brandon called. Martha nodded. I figured. Vanessa walked slowly toward her. He told me everything. The workshop? Everything. Martha saw tears already forming in her daughter's eyes. Together, they descended into the underground chamber. Vanessa stopped near one of the workbenches, the same way Brandon had, the same way everyone did. She simply stared. When Martha showed her the journal entries about the surgery, Vanessa covered her mouth. No. It was Silas. He paid for it? Martha nodded. The hospital never had a donor program. Vanessa sank onto a stool. For several moments, She couldn't speak. Finally, she whispered, "I never thanked him." "You couldn't. Why?" "Because he never wanted you to know." Tears slipped down Vanessa's cheeks. The workshop remained quiet around them. Later that evening, after most visitors had gone home, Evelyn Pike arrived carrying a small cedar box. Inside lay a folded letter, the final letter Silas had left behind. "He told me to give this to you when the time was right," Evelyn said. Martha unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was familiar, steady, patient, unmistakably Silas. As she began reading, the room fell silent. Every person present understood they were about to hear the final words of the man whose hidden generosity had changed an entire town, and perhaps discover what he wanted done with the workshop he had spent a lifetime building. The underground workshop became so quiet that Martha could hear her own heartbeat. She unfolded the letter carefully. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained steady. The handwriting of a man who had spent a lifetime building things meant to last. She began to read. "Nora." Martha stopped and smiled through her tears. Silas had accidentally started with the wrong name from an old draft and crossed it out. Below it, he had written, "Martha, if you're reading this, then the water didn't win. And if the water didn't win, then neither did the people who wanted this place forgotten. I never built this workshop for money. I built it because creating something useful felt like a way of saying, thank you for being alive. The furniture is yours. The tools, sir. The workshop is yours. But ownership isn't the important part. Do something good with it. Not for me. For whoever comes next." The letter ended there. Simple. Direct. Perfectly Silas. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Martha folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the cedar box. The workshop had given her answers. Now it had given her a responsibility. The weeks that followed transformed the property. Volunteers arrived almost every day. Some brought tools. Others brought lumber. Some simply brought willing hands. Gideon organized repair crews. The porch was reinforced. Broken windows were replaced. The roof was patched. The overgrown yard was cleared. Fresh grass slowly replaced weeds and mud. Louise kept everyone fed. No matter how many people appeared, somehow there was always enough food. Brandon came every weekend. He never offered excuses. He never tried to defend his mistakes. Instead, he worked. He repaired fences, carried lumber, cleaned debris, and when the day's work ended, he quietly sat in the workshop reading Silas's journals. Vanessa visited often as well. She brought her 2 children, a little girl named Emma and a boy named Caleb. Both instantly fell in love with the underground workshop. They spent hours exploring every corner. One afternoon, Emma discovered a small wooden bird displayed on a shelf. "Who made this?" Martha smiled. "Your great-uncle Silas." The girl held it carefully. "It's beautiful." Martha remembered saying those exact words when she was 7 years old. Some things came full circle. 3 months later, Martha drove to the county office. With Gideon's help, she submitted engineering reports proving the foundation remained sound. The flooding had been stopped. The structure was safe. The condemnation order was officially removed. When the notice came down from the front door, the entire town celebrated. Soon afterward, Martha announced her plan. The workshop would become a community learning center, a place where people could learn woodworking, craftsmanship, and practical skills. A place where Silas's tools would continue creating something useful. A place where his kindness could keep growing. The idea spread quickly. By autumn, the first students arrived. Teenagers, retirees, veterans, single parents, people who simply wanted to learn how to build something with their hands. The workshop came alive again. The sound of chisels returned. The smell of fresh cut wood filled the air. Laughter echoed beneath the stone ceiling. Gideon taught structural techniques. Martha taught patience. The journals became lesson books, and the furniture Silas left behind became examples of excellence. Even Brandon joined the classes. His first project was a small cedar box. The joints weren't perfect. The finish wasn't smooth. But he completed it himself. For the first time in years, Martha saw genuine pride in her son's eyes. Not pride in what he owned, pride in what he had created. 1 year after she arrived with $47 and a flooded basement, a new sign stood beside the road. Silas Rowan, Community Workshop. On a cool autumn evening,
Martha sat on the restored porch with Ranger sleeping at her feet.
The windows glowed warmly. Voices drifted upward from the workshop below. Students were still working, still learning, still building. She thought about the day her children laughed at her inheritance. They had seen a condemned house, a flooded basement, a worthless property. What they had missed was the real inheritance. Not furniture. Not money. Not land. A purpose. A legacy. A chance to help others. As the stars appeared above Ashwick, Martha looked toward the workshop entrance and smiled. The stairs still led down into the earth, but now they also led forward. And because of one quiet man named Silas Rowan, they always would.